Story 1. My name is Daniela, but the people at the hospital call me Danny. I'm 32 years old and I've been working as a nurse for over 10 years. I work at a hospital here in Sao Paulo. It's my life. I've always liked helping people, and being a nurse gives me that opportunity every day. My mother was also a nurse, so I think it's in my blood. The work is hard, especially on the night shift. My routine starts at 7 p.m. and goes until 7 a.m. We deal with all kinds of cases, but the ICU is always the most stressful part. There's no room for error. I've seen a lot of things there. I've lost patients who became friends, and that hurts, but we have to always move forward, keeping an eye on the next patient who needs help. That night I started my shift as usual, making my rounds in the ICU, checking on patients, adjusting their medications, and making sure everything was in order. I was reviewing the medical records when I noticed a man lying in bed 13. He was hooked up to several machines but seemed calm. I found it strange because I didn't remember having received any new patients that night. My first reaction was to check his medical records on the computer. There was nothing on them, no name, no history, nothing. I thought it was a system error. I called Dr. Marta, who was on duty with me that night, and she was also confused. We checked the admission records and called the front desk, but no one knew anything about him. Even so, we couldn't stop taking care of him. We examined the patient, checked his vital signs, and adjusted the machines as needed. He was stable, but the lack of any records was disturbing. We decided to keep him under close monitoring and try to resolve the situation in the morning when the administration would be available in the following days. That feeling that something was wrong only got worse every time I made my nightly rounds. The man in bed 13 was always there, the same way. Dr. Marta and I continued to monitor him, but the lack of any information about who he was or how he had gotten there made me uneasy. I started asking my colleagues about the patient. João Paulo, the morning shift nurse, said he had never seen anyone in bed 13. Carla, another nurse who works with me at night, also seemed not to notice anything different. Dr. Marta was equally perplexed, but strangely, it was as if the presence of that man did not affect her in the same way it affected me. It was as if I was the only one who really felt the weight of that situation. It was driving me crazy. I decided I needed to investigate on my own. During one of my nights off, I went to the hospital administration and asked to see the records of all the patients in the ICU. The person in charge of the file, Mr. Geraldo, looked at me suspiciously, but he ended up letting me take a look. I spent hours there reviewing all the papers, but I couldn't find anything about the man in bed 13. At the end of the night, exhausted and frustrated, I went to have a coffee in the break room. It was then that Mrs. Celia, a retired nurse who was visiting the hospital, approached me. She asked me what I was doing there so badly. When I told her about the mysterious patient, she turned pale. Mrs. Celia told me that many years ago, there was a patient in bed 13 who had died mysteriously. His name was Pedro, and he had suffered a serious accident. Despite the efforts of the medical team, he did not survive. The story was that even after he died, strange things continued to happen in bed 13. Some employees believed that his spirit still roamed the hospital. My heart raced. Pedro. That was the name I needed. That night I went home with a heavy mind. I needed to confront the patient the next night at work. I went to bed 13 with a mixture of fear and determination. When I got there, he was waiting for me as always with the same empty look. I tried to talk to him, but he remained with an empty look without answering anything. So I decided to go back to the hospital archives and look for his medical records. There it was, with all the details of the accident and his death. But the most disturbing thing was his photo. It was the same man I saw every night in bed 13. I went back to the ICU and, with the medical records in hand, I approached the patient. I showed him the photo and asked him what he wanted. To my surprise, he finally spoke, in a weak and distant voice. He said, "I just want someone to know what happened to me." My heart was in my mouth. I asked what he meant by that. Pedro said he had been a victim of medical negligence. On the night of the accident, the doctors were overwhelmed and did not give him the proper attention. He ended up dying because of a mistake that could have been avoided with this revelation. I felt a mixture of sadness and anger. I decided I needed to do something. The next day, I went to the hospital administration and reported what Pedro had told me. Although it was an old story, they opened an investigation. After I made the report about Pedro, something changed the next night. When I returned to the ICU, Pedro was no longer there. It was as if he had finally found peace. That figure that haunted me every night was no longer there, and although it was scary, he became part of my routine. The investigation into Pedro's death was taken seriously by the hospital administration. They went through the old files, interviewed employees who were still there from the time of his death, and even called in experts to review the case. They discovered that there had indeed been medical negligence. Pedro had died because of a mistake that could have been avoided if the medical staff had paid more attention. This revelation had a huge impact on the hospital. The ICU procedures were revamped, the medical staff underwent rigorous training, and the administration implemented a case review system to ensure that nothing like this would happen again. I never saw Pedro again after that, but in a way I feel that he is at peace. Knowing that his story was told and that his death was not in vain brings me some comfort. He achieved a kind of justice through me, and I also found some peace knowing that I helped to correct a mistake and improve patient care. Report 2. My name is Marcos and I am a nurse. After many years working in a hospital in Sao Paulo, I decided to face a change and seek new opportunities in another city. That's how I ended up getting a job at the hospital here. I confess that at first I was quite excited about the idea of starting over in a new place. It was a chance to explore different horizons in my career and also get to know a new community. But from the first days at the new hospital, something bothered me. I can't really explain what it was. Maybe it was the feeling of being in an unfamiliar environment, or maybe it was something deeper. Despite this, I kept my focus on work. After all, as a nurse, my priority has always been to take care of patients and ensure that they receive the best possible treatment. I knew that I needed to adapt to the new environment and do my best while trying to adjust to the frenetic pace of the new hospital. One case in particular caught my attention. A patient arrived at the emergency room in serious condition after a car accident. The doctors struggled to stabilize him, but his condition was critical and he was soon taken to the ICU where he fell into a coma. The patient, whose name was Daniel, had few relatives in the city. The only person who regularly came to visit him was his uncle, a middle-aged man named Cloves. He came every night, always with a worried expression on his face, but grateful for the care that I and the medical team gave to his nephew. Our conversations were simple and direct. Cloves talked about Daniel's personality and tastes as if he were sharing stories about a dear friend. He seemed genuinely concerned about his nephew's well-being and always thanked me for being there to take care of him. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. After all, it was natural for a close relative to be present to support a loved one in such a delicate situation. However, as the nights passed and Daniel remained in a coma, I began to notice something strange about Cloves' visits. Something was out of place, but I couldn't put my finger on it. As the days turned into weeks and Daniel remained in his coma, Cloves' visits became more frequent and intense. He arrived at the hospital at the same time each time with an expression of anxiety that did not go unnoticed. On one particularly dark night, while I was checking Daniel's vital signs, Clovis approached me with a worried look on his face and asked me to promise that I would take good care of him. His voice sounding more urgent than usual, I nodded, not fully understanding the gravity of his words. I told Cloves that we were doing our best to ensure that Daniel received the best possible treatment. Clovis fixed his eyes on me for a moment as if assessing whether he could trust me, and then said, "I know I can trust you, Marcos. You are the only hope we have." His words left me perplexed, but before I could ask any questions, Cloves quickly walked away as if he was running away from something that was haunting him. That night, as I reflected on the strange exchange with Cloves, a feeling of uneasiness settled in my chest. What did he mean by hope? And why did I feel so uncomfortable in his presence? One night when I was in the intensive care ward, I was startled by an agitated murmur coming from Daniel's bed. I ran there and saw the monitors showing signs of unusual activity. Daniel was moving his limbs, his eyes moving under his closed eyelids. I immediately called the medical team and soon they were all around Daniel's bed, watching with anticipation. And then, as if waking from a deep sleep, Daniel opened his eyes. It was a moment of relief and shock. After all, Daniel had been in a coma for weeks and his recovery was a true miracle. But as Daniel began to adjust to reality, one thing stood out. Clovis' visits had completely ceased during the entire period he was in a coma. He had been coming to visit him religiously every night, but from the moment Daniel woke up, Clovis had completely disappeared. his absence leaving a strange and unsettling void as if a familiar presence had been abruptly cut off. As the medical team continued to monitor Daniel closely, I couldn't help but wonder what had happened to Cloves. After Cloves' strange disappearance, I felt the need to talk to Daniel about his uncle's absence. As I made my morning rounds, I approached Daniel's bedside where he sat staring out the window. "Daniel, do you remember your Uncle Cloves?" I asked hesitantly. Daniel turned to me, a look of melancholy crossing his face. "Of course, Marcos. Cloves was my favorite uncle, my mentor. He was always there for me," Daniel said. I felt a shiver run down my spine as Daniel talked about Cloves. "Did you know he was coming to visit you every night while you were in a coma?" I asked cautiously. Daniel's eyes widened in surprise. "This can't be possible, Marcos. Cloves died years ago in a car accident," Daniel said in shock. Daniel's revelation left me speechless. Was it possible that Cloves was showing up at the hospital every night talking to me about Daniel's well-being if he had been dead for so long? As Daniel and I faced the revelation about Cloves, a sense of calm and acceptance began to settle in our hearts despite the mystery and strangeness of the circumstances. Daniel seemed calm, as if the encounter with his uncle from the beyond comforted him somehow. "Marcos, I think my uncle came from the beyond to make sure I was okay. He was always very protective even after he left," Daniel said with a tender smile on his lips. These words echoed in my mind, and a sense of peace replaced the fear and uncertainty we had felt before. Perhaps Cloves was indeed watching over Daniel in some way even after his death. As the days passed and Daniel continued to slowly recover, the memory of Cloves' visits to the hospital became a comforting memory. Daniel was discharged shortly after. It seemed like a miracle, but he was fully recovered. I believe that Uncle Cloves' visits helped Daniel recover. After this episode, I continued my work life as normal. I only shared this story with my closest friends, but I did not tell anyone at the hospital. Report 3. My name is Julia. I am a nurse at a well-known hospital whose name I will not mention. I have worked here for a long time, and in that time I have seen a lot. The routine is tough, but I love what I do. The hospital is big and always full, and we work hard to provide the best care for patients. My specialty is caring for patients in the ICU. It is a difficult area, but we deal with people in critical condition, often fighting for their lives. I have gotten used to the tense environment, with the machines beeping with the emergencies that arise, but there is always that moment of relief when we manage to stabilize a patient or see them improve. However, a while ago, things started to get strange. It was something I noticed in a subtle way, but it grew. Terminal patients, those who we know are in their last days, started to die quickly and peacefully. At first, no one thought it was strange. We were even relieved to know, because no one likes to see someone suffering. But what caught our attention the most was that the cases started to increase. A peaceful death here, another there, and suddenly it seemed that all the terminal patients were leaving in an almost too serene way. I remember well one specific night. I was doing my routine in the ICU, checking the monitors and checking on the patients when I noticed that Mrs. Marissa, a terminal cancer patient, had passed away. She was calm, almost smiling, and this wouldn't be strange if it weren't for the fact that that same week 3 other terminal patients had passed away in the same way. So I started to wonder if it was just a coincidence or if there was something more behind these peaceful deaths. I mentioned it to Jacques, a colleague on duty, and she said she had noticed it too. We were suspicious, but in the middle of the rush at the hospital we didn't have much time to think about it. But the strange feeling wouldn't leave me alone. It seemed like there was a pattern, something that was happening right under our noses, but that no one could see. I decided that I needed to know what was going on. After all, taking care of patients isn't just about giving them medicine and changing bandages. We have to understand what's happening to them, especially when something seems out of the ordinary. I decided that I couldn't ignore this any longer. I started investigating more closely by talking to other coworkers and analyzing the medical records of patients who had died mysteriously. That's when I found a disturbing pattern. All the patients who had passed away quickly and peacefully had been cared for by one nurse in particular, Andre. He was a new guy at the hospital, always quiet but very efficient at his job. At first I thought it was just a coincidence, but the more I researched, the more convinced I became that something was wrong. I spoke to Jacques about my findings, and she also found the suspect. We decided to observe Andre more closely without raising suspicions. We began to notice that he was always around when the patients left, and that his presence seemed to bring a supernatural calm to the environment. I decided to confront Andre about my suspicions, but he vehemently denied any involvement in the patients' deaths. He seemed genuinely shocked by the accusations, and I confess that for a moment I doubted myself, but something inside me insisted that he knew more than he was saying, and I was determined to find out the truth. My suspicions about Andre only grew with each passing day. I couldn't get the idea out of my head that he was somehow connected to the mysterious deaths of terminally ill patients. I decided that I needed to gather more evidence before making any official accusations. So I started observing him more closely. One night, while I was making my rounds in the critically ill ward, I saw Andre entering Mr. Miguel's room, an elderly man who was fighting a terminal illness. I hid, watching through the crack in the door as he approached the patient's bed. What I saw next left me cold. Andre began to whisper something in Mr. Miguel's ear, words that I couldn't understand. The elderly man seemed to relax immediately, as if he were being hypnotized. I was paralyzed with horror, unable to believe what I was seeing. After a few minutes, Andre left the room as if nothing had happened. I ran to Miguel, but it was too late. He was dead with a serene expression on his face. That only confirmed my suspicions. Andre was somehow causing the deaths of the patients. But since I decided it was time to act, I went straight to the hospital administration office and told Dr. Carla, the director, everything. She was shocked. But she knew we needed concrete evidence to charge Andre. We called hospital security and decided to monitor his movements closely. The next morning, while we were going through the records of people entering and leaving the terminally ill ward, we found something disturbing. Andre had been present at all the cases of quick and peaceful deaths in the last few months. That was the proof we needed, but there was still something darker behind it all. With the evidence in hand, we confronted Andre. He vehemently denied any involvement in the deaths of the patients. But the records didn't lie, given the irrefutable evidence. He finally gave in and confessed. According to him, he could no longer bear to see the suffering of terminally ill patients. He felt he was doing them a favor by helping them pass away quickly and peacefully. But what he revealed next was even more disturbing. Andre admitted that he was performing a macabre ritual to facilitate the patient's passage to the afterlife. He believed that by performing this ritual he was helping them find peace at the moment of death. He told us that he learned these methods from an old mentor, a healer he met during a trip to the interior of the country. He also confessed that although he believed he was helping, he had no control over the consequences of the ritual and that some deaths had been more traumatic than he expected. That was beyond what I could have imagined. Andre was playing with forces he did not understand, putting the lives of patients at risk and disrespecting the ethics and values of the profession. With Andre's confession, the police were called and he was arrested for manslaughter. The hospital underwent an investigation, reinforcing security protocols to ensure that something like this would never happen again. But even with the end of this macabre story, I couldn't get the images of the patients leaving in such a peaceful but at the same time disturbing way out of my head. That would forever be a scar in my memory, a dark reminder of how evil can hide even in the most unexpected places. For more stories like this, follow the channel Hunter of Darkness. Don't forget to like and leave your comment.